Hey, Lieutenant Frankenstein, did your toaster blow up, or is that just your idea of combat? The words cracked through the cavernous maintenance hangar at Dover Air Force Base like a dropped wrench. Laughter followed, harsh, adolescent, and echoing off the steel ribs of the building. Lieutenant Alyssa Monroe didn't look up from the circuit board she was calibrating. Her hands, steady, scarred, precise, continued their work as if the insult hadn't landed, but those watching knew it had. Private Nolan Carter grinned like a man who'd just won a bet. He leaned back against a tool cart, arms folded across his chest. Around him, a half-dozen fresh recruits snickered, emboldened by the silence. What? It's a fair question, Carter said, motioning toward her arms. You'd think someone who looks like she wrestled a blowtorch would be giving lectures, not fixing GPS units. No one stopped him. Not the junior techs. Not the shift supervisor who had slipped out for coffee. The morning hum of drills and hydraulic pumps continued indifferent to the unfolding humiliation. But not everyone in that hangar misunderstood what they were witnessing. Alyssa Monroe exhaled slowly and set down her tool. For a brief second, she closed her eyes, shutting out the hangar, the stares, the shame. Then she turned her gaze on Carter, calm, dark, and cutting. Private, she said, her voice even. You've got a lot of questions. Maybe someday you'll learn how to ask the right ones. But Carter didn't. He smirked, shrugged, and turned away. Because to him, and to most of the new arrivals, Monroe was just another quiet, mid-level officer who kept to herself and never spoke about the scars that climbed her forearms like burned vines. And yet, nothing about Alyssa Monroe's presence fit the mold. Her movements were too measured, her discipline too absolute. She worked like a woman who had nothing left to prove, but far too much to forget. What Carter and his audience didn't know was this Lieutenant Monroe had once been Colonel Alyssa Monroe, callsign Shadow, a former operative of the most classified Black Ops division in the U.S. military. Her current post was not a demotion, it was a cover, and the scars, not from kitchen mishaps or maintenance errors, but from Operation Iron Veil, a mission so dangerous, its after-action report was still sealed under presidential order. She hadn't asked for sympathy. She hadn't revealed her past. Because warriors like Monroe didn't speak for recognition. They spoke through silence and let fools write their own downfall. Unfortunately for Private Carter, that downfall had already begun, and High Command was about to walk through the door. The sound of Carter's laughter pierced the hangar again, louder this time, sharper, the kind of cruel amusement that seeks an audience. I mean, look at her arms, he said, pointing in Monroe's direction as if she were an exhibit. If those are combat scars, I'm a fighter pilot. Please, she probably burned herself cooking ramen. The other recruits snickered. One elbowed another, whispering something about fire safety briefings. The tension that had been simmering all morning now cracked like static in the air. Lieutenant Alyssa Monroe didn't look up from the panel she was wiring on the maintenance scaffolding, but her hands briefly paused just long enough for someone paying attention to notice. Her grip tightened on the cable spool, and her breath caught for half a second before steadying again. Private Nolan Carter didn't notice. He was too caught up in his performance, his ego bloated from the laughter of others mistaking silence for weakness. He stood tall in his fresh uniform, his sleeves rolled precisely to regulation, his boots shined like mirrors, but his character, polished only on the surface, now stood under scrutiny he hadn't yet realized was coming. What do you think? Monroe Carter called out mockingly. You ever going to tell us the real story? Or are you going to keep pretending those marks came from some top secret op none of us can read about? He made air quotes with his fingers, voice dripping with sarcasm. So mysterious. Several heads turned. This wasn't teasing anymore, it was an accusation. Alyssa slowly stood from the wiring bench. Her movements were precise, restrained. Her gaze drifted toward Carter for a moment, unreadable. But before she could respond, a new sound echoed across the hangar floor, heavy boots, confident, commanding, the kind of cadence that made veterans instinctively straighten. A column of officers had just entered the far side of the hangar. There was no announcement, just presence. At the center of the group walked General Helen Brooks, her 4 stars catching the fluorescent light. Beside her were a colonel, a technical inspector, and several command-level aides. Their visit was unannounced and rare, an upper-echelon inspection tied to strategic air readiness, and they had heard everything. Carter's voice still lingered in the hangar when they stopped walking. General Brooks turned her head sharply toward the recruits, her eyes scanning faces. What was that I just heard, Private? She said, her voice crisp, neutral, but with a warning edge that cut deeper than any shout. Carter froze, color draining from his face. Ma'am, I was just joking. Nothing serious. Brooks narrowed her eyes, stepping forward. Joking, she repeated, her tone sharpening. You were mocking a fellow airman's service record in front of peers during duty hours. That's what I walked into. Ma'am, I didn't know. You didn't know what Private Carter Brooks asked. Her eyes locked on his, didn't know who she is, or didn't think it mattered. Silence. Alyssa Monroe stood still at her station, her arms exposed now in the rising warmth of the hangar. The scars that crossed them gleamed faintly burned, tissue surgical lines, healed wounds earned far from this polished concrete floor. General Brooks turned her attention to Alyssa then. Her expression softened slightly, just enough for someone to catch the shift. Lieutenant Monroe, she said evenly. Permission to speak freely, ma'am? Alyssa nodded. Granted, General. Brooks turned back to Carter. Do you know where Lieutenant Monroe served before this assignment? Carter opened his mouth but found no answer. He looked around. No one moved to rescue him. Brooks stepped beside Monroe and looked directly at the assembled recruits. Lieutenant Monroe was part of a covert rescue mission in Syria 3 years ago, Operation Ashfall. You won't read about it in the press, and you won't find it on her personnel summary. You don't have clearance. But I do. The recruits looked stunned. Whispers rippled quietly. She led an evac of 7 NATO personnel trapped under active fire. Brooks continued, took third-degree burns on both arms from a cockpit fire while pulling a pilot from a downed craft. She didn't leave until every one of them was out. Carter stared at Monroe as if seeing her for the first time. General Brooks didn't blink. After 3 surgeries and a year of recovery, Lieutenant Monroe requested reactivation. She asked for maintenance, not because she couldn't return to combat, but because she believed this is where she was most needed. You know how many combat heroes asked to fix aircraft after getting burned alive? Not many. Monroe looked down, her posture humble but unshaken. Brooks turned back to Carter. You saw scars and assumed incompetence. What you should have seen was valor. What you should have shown was respect. Carter swallowed hard, visibly trembling now. The general's voice dropped, but somehow carried further. That private is why we don't judge what we don't understand, especially not those who've bled for your freedom to joke. The silence that followed felt like judgment itself. Colonel Langston, standing just behind Brooks, stepped forward. Private Carter, you're relieved of duty for the day. You will report to Command Ethics Training at 0700 tomorrow. Uniform inspection mandatory. A written statement of apology will be submitted before KAB. Carter nodded mutely, eyes down. General Brooks turned back to Monroe. Lieutenant, thank you for your continued service. Alyssa met her gaze. I serve with pride, ma'am. Brooks gave a curt nod, then turned to the stunned recruits. Let this moment remind you, not all warriors carry their battles on the outside. Some carry them in silence. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who saved the most lives. And with that, she walked on, leaving a silence far louder than the laughter that had come before. The silence in Hangar 14 was thunderous. Private Nolan Carter stood frozen, the smug grin on his face evaporating as General Helen Brooks took a measured step toward him, her boot falls slicing through the tension like a blade. You seem to have quite a lot to say. Private, she said, voice calm but loaded. I didn't mean anything by it, ma'am, Carter stammered. It was just a joke, General. General Brooks turned slightly. Her eyes moving past Carter and settling on Lieutenant Alyssa Monroe, but this time there was something different in her gaze, recognition, reverence, and something else, regret. Lieutenant Monroe Brooks said, though there was a subtle shift in her tone. Permission to speak freely. Alyssa Monroe looked up slowly from the control panel she had returned to moments earlier, her expression unreadable. For a long beat, she said nothing. Then with calm precision, she nodded. Granted, ma'am. General Brooks turned to face the room, her voice rising not loud, but commanding. You all know her as Lieutenant Monroe. What you don't know, what most of you were never cleared to know, is that she's also known by another name. Brooks paused, letting the words hang. Call sign Shadow. Murmurs rippled through the hangar. Several of the senior mechanics glanced at one another. The name carried weight. Stories passed between units often dismissed as myth, a specter of Black Ops legend. Brooks continued. Shadow was the tactical commander during Operation Iron Veil, one of the most classified missions in recent history. She led a six-man team behind enemy lines for 72 hours. The mission objective: intercept and neutralize a mobile chemical weapons convoy headed for a civilian population center. No one spoke. During the first night, Brooks said, now pacing slowly, her unit was ambushed. She was burned arms back and left shoulder while pulling a wounded airman from a downed drone wreckage that exploded. Her extraction was compromised, comms disabled. She completed the mission anyway, alone. Carter's face had drained of color. She coordinated an airstrike using salvaged components, neutralized the convoy, and held position until rescue arrived 3 days later. 137 lives were saved because of her actions. I was the one who debriefed her afterward. She refused a promotion, refused transfer to DC. She said, and I quote, "I'll serve where I'm needed, not where I'm noticed." Alyssa didn't move. Her hands rested calmly on the edge of the workbench, but those closest could see her jaw tighten, memories returning like ghosts in the hangar's humming silence. Her current assignment and rank were part of a cover. Brooks continued. Operation Iron Veil remains classified. She accepted reduced visibility to maintain national security. What she didn't accept was being mocked for scars she earned under fire. The weight of the words crushed the room. Senior Master Sergeant Raiden, who had worked beside Monroe for months without ever asking about her past, swallowed hard and stepped back from his clipboard. Brooks turned to Carter. "You accused her of faking scars. You suggested her injuries were a joke. Do you have anything to say?" Now Carter opened his mouth. Nothing came out. General Brooks didn't wait. Effective immediately, Private Carter will be placed on disciplinary leave. Further action will be determined after formal review. Any other personnel who laughed along, you'll report to base counseling and anti-harassment re-education. Consider this a second chance. Use it. She faced the hangar now as a whole. I want every person in this room to understand something: rank doesn't always reflect service. Some heroes don't wear medals on their chest, they wear silence because their sacrifices were made in shadows. Brooks turned back to Monroe. This time she saluted. The four-star general, in front of over a dozen stunned airmen, rendered a crisp, formal salute to a woman in maintenance coveralls. "Colonel Monroe," she said with pride, "it is my honor to serve beside you." Alyssa Monroe slowly stood, eyes steady, and returned the salute. "Thank you, General." And just like that, the scarred officer no one took seriously was no longer invisible. She was a legend, revealed. Under the searing silence that followed General Helen Brooks's revelation, no one dared move. The air in the hangar was no longer thick with mockery, it pulsed with awe. Colonel Alyssa Monroe stood perfectly still beside her workbench, the burn scars on her arms now cast in an entirely new light. Where once there had been whispers and sneers, there was now reverence. Not one wrench clanged, not one chuckle echoed. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Then came the sound of boots, slow, deliberate, commanding. General Brooks stepped toward Monroe and came to a crisp halt directly before her. Without hesitation, the four-star general raised her hand in salute. "Colonel Monroe," she said, voice ringing with unwavering clarity, "it is an honor to serve in the same Air Force as you." The gesture sent a ripple through the assembled crew. No one expected it. Certainly not Private Nolan Carter, who stood frozen a few feet away, his complexion drained of color. His eyes shifted from General Brooks to the scarred woman before him, the woman he had mocked so casually minutes earlier. Now revealed not just as a superior officer, but as a war hero with a service record he couldn't even fathom. Alyssa Monroe returned the salute with practiced precision, her face calm. But behind her eyes a storm brewed, not of anger, but of restrained humility. Brooks lowered her hand and addressed the hangar. "This woman before you, Colonel Alyssa Monroe, call sign Shadow, spent 72 hours behind enemy lines during Operation Iron Veil. She refused exfiltration after the first blast, choosing instead to remain in the kill zone to complete the mission. She was wounded, outnumbered, and still managed to neutralize a biological threat that could have killed thousands." Gasps punctuated the still air. The younger recruits looked visibly shaken. They had mocked her burns, her silence, her choice to serve quietly in the shadows, and yet she had done more in one operation than most of them would do in their entire careers. Private Carter's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Ma'am, I didn't know." Monroe turned slowly to face him. She didn't glare. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him steady, unblinking. "No, Private Carter," she replied softly. "You didn't ask." That single sentence hit harder than any reprimand ever could. Carter's shoulders slumped. He stepped forward slowly, eyes glassy. "I want to apologize, ma'am, for my words, for my ignorance. I assumed things I had no right to. I was cruel for the sake of a cheap laugh. And I'm sorry." General Brooks folded her arms, watching closely. Monroe gave a small nod. Apology accepted. "But make sure the lesson sticks, Private. Respect isn't given because of scars or stories. It's owed to every uniform, every rank, every sacrifice you don't see." Other recruits began stepping forward too, one by one. They stood in a loose line like nervous cadets at inspection, each offering their own apologies, not just for laughing, but for staying silent, for enabling, for forgetting the very oath they had taken. Ma'am said Airman Phelps, a wiry recruit who had smirked along with Carter. "I didn't say anything, but I didn't stop it either. I failed that test." "You're not the only one," Monroe replied, "but you won't get many chances to do it right the next time, so learn from this one." Master Sergeant Holloway, a grizzled mechanic with 3 decades of service, stepped forward last. "Colonel, I knew you weren't just another tech, but I didn't speak up either. I should have shut that down sooner. That's on me." Monroe shook her head gently. "We've all had to choose when to speak and when to stay quiet. Just remember which one serves better next time." General Brooks addressed the room again, her voice firm. "Let this moment serve as your first real lesson in leadership," she said. "True warriors don't need to boast. They don't need medals on display to deserve your respect. Colonel Monroe has taught you something you won't find in any manual: what strength looks like when it doesn't need to be loud." She turned to Carter. "Private, your conduct will be reviewed and your future here is in question. But your apology is a start. If you want to earn your place, you'll start by honoring those who already have." "Yes, ma'am," Carter said, swallowing hard. As the officers began to leave the hangar, Monroe returned to her workstation. But something had shifted. The recruits no longer whispered behind her back. They stood straighter. They watched her with something approaching reverence. Colonel Monroe had come to the hangar seeking quiet duty. Instead, she had taught an entire base a lesson they would never forget. And Private Carter. He would spend the rest of his career trying to live up to the standard set by the woman he had once mocked, now known to him and the world as Shadow. Colonel Alyssa Monroe stood in front of the assembled crew just days after the incident, not to scold or seek retribution, but to lead. In the same hangar where she had once quietly fixed aircraft, she now stood as a symbol of resilience and quiet command. Her first order of business wasn't discipline, it was education. "I don't want Private Carter punished," she told the senior staff. "I want him and every one of us to learn." True to her word, Monroe worked with base leadership to enroll Carter in an intensive veteran sensitivity and leadership training course. It wasn't easy. For the first few weeks, Carter kept his head down, battling shame and discomfort. But slowly, something shifted. The more he learned about the invisible wounds carried by veterans, the sacrifices made without parade or recognition, the more his perspective changed. He started volunteering at the base's VA Outreach Center. He sought conversations instead of avoiding them. He listened. 6 months later, Carter stood before a new class of recruits sharing his story, not to justify what he had done, but to prevent it from happening again. "I mocked someone I didn't understand," he told them. "And it took one of the bravest people I've ever met to show me what respect really looks like." The hangar, once a place of tension and careless words, transformed under Monroe's quiet leadership. New protocols emphasized empathy and service awareness. Veteran briefings became part of every new airman's onboarding. The story of Operation Iron Veil and Colonel Monroe's true identity became part of base culture, not as myth, but as a moral compass. Monroe never asked for recognition. She still arrived early, still worked with the same steady hands, still preferred action over attention. But now, when she walked through the hangar, silence didn't follow. Admiration did. Her scars, once the target of ridicule, became emblems of service, etched into the foundation of a new culture. And for every recruit who passed through Dover Air Force Base, her story wasn't just remembered, it was taught. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, sometimes the greatest strength is quiet endurance. Colonel Monroe showed us that true leadership isn't about rank or recognition. It's about using hardship as a bridge, not a wall. If her story moved you, leave a comment below. Share how someone's quiet strength changed your life. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of redemption, resilience, and the kind of courage that speaks without needing to shout.